Fast and sleek, looking every inch the thoroughbred fighter it was, the North American P-51 Mustang rose from obscurity to carve out a unique place in aviation history. Loved by its pilots and feared by its enemies, the Mustang possessed a rare blend of speed, agility, and range that made it an unbeatable air-to-air fighter.
Pilot's airplane. A real comfortable pilot's airplane. Very honest. No bad habits, no bad tendencies. Great performance. Lots of armament, lots of gas, lots of fuel. It was a superior airplane in performance all around. I think it was the airplane of the war on any side.
I don't know how to describe it. As I said, they were very responsive. You felt you could outfly anything. It was an easy plane to take off, to land. It was very maneuverable.
It had more power, more maneuverability, more speed, more climb. It probably was better than anything the Germans had by 2%. I was in a lot of dogfights where I was very happy with my 2%.
When the Mustang appeared in the skies over Europe, the United States Army Air Force pilots finally had the ability to carry the fight to the Luftwaffe over Nazi Germany itself.
Oh, those planes were very maneuverable. The 109s and 190 were a good airplane the Germans had. But then we got the 51s, which was a different story altogether. And when you got in this 51, and you think to yourself, oh, God, if this damn thing ever quits on. But that Merlin engine would run like an old Model A Ford. Just ran forever.
Now, when the P-51 came along, that changed the range. Gosh, we can fly forever in a P-51. And I think my longest P-51 mission was a little over 6 hours. P-38, 4.5 hours would be about the longest one, maybe 4:45. So there are some targets that became available to us after we got the P-51.
And while the German Focke-Wulf and Messerschmitt outclassed earlier American fighters, the P-51 outperformed them both. Plane for plane, nothing could beat a Mustang with a good man behind the stick.
I got behind this guy on a descending course and was gaining on him, and I opened fire, and I had a number of hits on his wings and fuselage, and he immediately broke hard up. And again, I was overrunning him, so I had to go up and then back down. But when I turned back down, I found him coming up at me, and I not to this day figured out how he did that. But I know that he got on my tail. The 109 has a 20-millimeter cannon that fires right through the hub of the propeller. And I went into a Lufberry circle. That's as tight a circle as you can turn. And he was directly behind me, so that my only view of him was to look straight back like this and every time I looked, that 20-millimeter cannon was blinking, and I've got nothing but a thin plexiglass cover over my head. Fortunately, those shells were going just behind my tail. I made, I think, probably 75 to 100 circles, but whether it was the Mustang that much better than the 109, or whether I was that much better than him, or a combination of both, I was gaining on him. And he finally rolled over and headed straight down, and I decided to let him get away. And he got away, and so did I. I hit him, he didn't hit me, but we had a 10-minute individual battle.
though today the Mustang is considered to be one of the greatest American fighters ever built. Oddly enough, it began its career as a reconnaissance aircraft flown not by the United States, but by Britain's Royal Air Force. It would take almost 4 years for the Mustang to evolve into a war winner. 4 years that started with an odd request at an impossible deadline in the darkest days of World War II.
The British were looking to the U.S. aircraft manufacturers to make fighter aircraft for them. They approached North American hoping they would build P-40 Warhawks. North American came back at them with a counter-proposal. They would design and build and fly a completely new aircraft within 100 days.
At the time in 1940, the British were utterly desperate for anything that could be a combat-ready fighter, so they were going all over the United States looking for anything that they could purchase. When North American made their proposal, the Brits actually snapped at the opportunity. They just went for it because they needed aircraft quickly, and North American was promising delivery of the prototype within 100 days or so, and they were promising an aircraft better than the P-40, and they needed something better than the Tomahawk. And in fact, North American did exactly what they promised. In 117 days, they had the prototype of the P-51 Mustang, which was called the NA-73, constructed. And within 130 days, that prototype flew for the first time.
The British initially ordered 600 of the P-51s, and they're very enthusiastic about this aircraft. However, despite that enthusiasm by their British allies, the American aviation authorities are really not interested in the P-51 at all until 2 years later.
The Royal Air Force soon took delivery of about 600 of the North American fighters, which they dubbed the Mustang I. British pilots soon discovered they had a terrific low-level aircraft on their hands. With the top speed of almost 390 miles an hour on the deck, the Mustang I was probably the fastest American fighter of its day. Light on the controls, very agile, and capable of climbing at over 3,000 feet a minute, the Mustang looked like a real winner. However, the new plane did have its share of serious drawbacks.
The original Mustangs came out with Allison engines. They were extremely good for low-level work. And that's what the British used them for. Low-level fighter sweeps, tactical recon. They were unsuited for long-range escort work because the engine could not perform adequately at high altitude.
While the Mustang I did not have exceptional high-altitude performance, the British still loved the aircraft because down low, it was awesome. It was fast, it was quick, it could get away from anything. So they used it in a variety of roles, mainly low-altitude TAC recon and armed reconnaissance against ground targets. But sooner or later, they were bound to come into contact with the Luftwaffe, and in August of 1942, the first Mustang kill of the war was scored. And it's kind of an interesting incident because the fellow, Hollis Hills, was a Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who happened to be an American, flying an American aircraft in British service. And he shot down a Focke-Wulf 190. So it was one of those incidents of the war that truly reflected the international character of the Allied war effort.
Flying at treetop level and facing scores of light and medium flak batteries on every mission, the brave Mustang pilots pressed on, snapping photos of key installations and shooting up anything on the ground that moved. While the British found the Mustang very useful in Western Europe at first, the United States Army Air Force had little interest in the new fighter. It took some time before the Americans could be won over by the glowing reports coming back from the RAF on the Mustang combat record. Almost reluctantly, the USAAF ordered a small number of Mustangs, dubbed the P-51A, and sent them to observation and tactical reconnaissance squadrons. Unfortunately, the Allison engine and its lack of a supercharger continued to limit the plane's high-level performance, a fact not lost upon the American pilots.
The very first P-51s were the A, had an Allison engine, and they were used for dive bombing and various things, but they were not very impressive.
I flew an A, a few hours in an A out of England, just practicing. We didn't have enough airplanes, and so I flew. We had a couple of A's on the field, and I flew that to practice some dive bombing, because it was basically a dive bomber. They didn't have the power, and they were just not as responsive. It had an Allison engine in it, and it really couldn't keep up with much of anything. As I said, it was primarily a dive bomber.
In late 1942, North American, utilizing some of the best features of the P-51A, unveiled a new version of the Mustang designed as a single-seat dive bomber and called it the A-36 Apache.
Only a couple hundred A-36s were produced, enough to equip a couple of fighter bomber groups, and those fighter bomber groups ended up serving in the Mediterranean or in Burma. The problem with the A-36 was it couldn't carry a heavy load, especially compared to the P-47, so it didn't last long in service. It was also vulnerable to ground fire, and in steep dives, the pilots had a tendency to torque the tail section and actually do structural damage in steep dives. So it was not particularly effective as a combat dive bomber, but what it did do was deliver ordnance with pinpoint accuracy far above and beyond anything that the other fighter bombers the Army Air Force had at the time.
Coming in at a medium altitude, the Apache squadron would line up on their targets, then wing over into steep dives, opening their butterfly flaps as they went to slow their descent. Using their reflector gunships to aim, the pilots would wait until the very last possible moment to drop their bombs. At about 1,000 feet, they would pull up and come off a target. Such hair-raising dives took nerves of steel and excellent marksmanship. But when done right, no other Army Air Force aircraft could get its bombs on target with better accuracy. And since it had derived from a fighter, the A-36 could find its way out of trouble. In fact, Apache pilots scored many air-to-air victories, and at least one even became an ace. While the A-36 enjoyed limited success, dive bombing never really gained acceptance in an Army Air Force dominated by strategic bombing advocates. After serving about a year, the dive bomber groups were all re-equipped and given fighters. In the A-36, the Mustang had reached an evolutionary dead end. But just when it looked like it would barely be a footnote to the European air campaign, a few inventive minds rescued North American's design and gave it a new lease on life. By mid-1943, the Mustang had seen combat as a reconnaissance aircraft, a dive bomber, and a ground attack fighter. As a pure fighter, however, it seemed destined to be a failure. But just as it appeared, the Mustang would be relegated to minor roles in the air war. A few men came up with a brilliant idea that would transform the P-51 into the most effective air superiority fighter history has ever seen.
There was a British pilot by the name of Harker who got the idea of taking a Mustang 1 airframe and mating it with a British Merlin engine. And he proposed this to a U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force colonel by the name of Hitchcock, who agreed that this might be a worthy thing to do. So they went off and they got approval for this, and they took a Merlin engine, put it into a Mustang, and discovered that they had a thoroughbred fighter with excellent high-altitude capability. The Merlin was being produced in the United States at the time by Packard. And so pretty soon the approval was given to produce the Mustang with the Packard-built Merlin engine. And that became the P-51B, the first true strategic fighter of World War II.
The British engine that Packard built was extremely reliable. It was a great engine, lots of power, and altitude performance. Had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger that let it get to high altitude. So it was a superior performer in every way.
With a top speed of almost 450 miles an hour at high altitude, the Merlin-powered Mustang now had the engine needed to carry the fight to the Luftwaffe as an air-to-air fighter. British and German fighters generally had an endurance of about 2 to 3 hours, which meant their combat radius was somewhere around 300 miles. With additional long-range drop tanks, the Mustangs soon proved they could fly for up to 8 hours. That meant the P-51 could range over the farthest reaches of Nazi Germany and still return back to their bases. The United States Army Air Force had its strategic fighter, and it appeared on the scene not too soon after. Through the fall of 1943, the heavy bombers of America's 8th Air Force had been taking a beating over Germany. Without escort fighters, the 8s, B-17s, and B-24s were being shot to pieces by the Luftwaffe. Their bomber generals had begun screaming for a new fighter that could stay with their groups all the way back to Berlin. It seemed a tall order, but the new P-51B fit the bill perfectly.
In the early part of the war, before the Mustangs came in, they couldn't get escort beyond a certain point. The 47s and 38s could only take them part way, and then they had to go back. And when our group came, we could take them clear into target and pick them back up on the other side. So, of course, there were only a handful of us initially, and but we were able to help them a little bit. Later, of course, 51s were all over the place. We used to watch them in prison camp, and when they'd go over, and it looked like each bomber had their own 51 escort with them.
The P-51s were the workhorses. There were so many more P-51s because their range was farther, and I think their maneuverability was better. They were our little buddies. They didn't have much use for us. They didn't understand what it was like to drive a truck.
In December of 1943, the first P-51B group, the 354th, arrived in England.
We flew the P-39 up until we got to Europe, up until we left for Europe. We had no idea what we were going to fly when we landed. They cut orders sending Jack Bradley and Bob Stevens and myself to an English base to check out a new airplane. When we got back, they were already bringing P-51s in, B model, and so we were off and running in P-51.
New to combat, the 354th promptly received an education at the hands of the Luftwaffe.
We learned that combat is not really fun sport. On the first mission, my first mission was about 3 hours, and the weather was terrible. We were in danger of mid-air collision with each other. I saw no enemy aircraft, but one did come in and shot one plane down. We lost a plane and a pilot on our very first mission, on the first mission I flew. It was the second mission the group flew. And so I found out that this is serious. Pete Quezada was our commanding general, head of 9th Fighter Command at that time. Pete came in and talked to us, and I remember him saying, "Now, you are in a very serious business. Not all of you will live to get home.
With their new weapon, however, the Pioneer Mustangs did not take long to score. On December 13, 1943, a pilot from the group's 355th Fighter Squadron shot down an Me-110 over Kiel, Germany. It would be the first of 700 kills, but the price of victory was high.
We went overseas with about 75 pilots in the group, maybe 80 counting pilots in group and so forth. And we lost 220. And you got to stop to think that we're the number one scoring group in the war, that we had more victories per loss than any other group, and yet we lose over double our numbers in the 2.5 years we were in combat, 2 years we were in combat.
At first, the Germans were puzzled by the appearance of the Mustang over what had been their own skies. Luftwaffe pilots frequently mistook the 51 for an Me-109 that led to some strange episodes in the air.
The Germans didn't know what it was, and in fact, on one early mission, a 109 joined the formation and flew alongside for 10 seconds before he recognized what he had done and peeled off, and I headed away. I don't remember whether somebody got him or not.
Indeed, the P-51 resembled the Me-109 profile so closely that even American aviators were fooled on occasion.
Because of the greenhouse canopy, it looked very much like an Me-109. So one of the problems we initially had was getting shot at by our own aircraft. P-47s primarily, never ran into any 38s, and the 17s and 24s.
Despite the recognition problems both sides had with the Merlin engine Mustangs, the new fighter quickly proved it could change the entire nature of the strategic air war over Europe.
Well, of course, we could go a lot farther than we could previously. I think the operation of the missions remained the same, but the tactics had changed. Initially, early on with the P-38, we were not allowed to leave the bombers. When the tactics changed that we could go out ahead of the bombers and attack the German fighter force as it was climbing up to do battle against the heavies, that was when the shades of war changed, because we had a lot better chance to kill the German Air Force if we could go out and attack them ahead of the bomber force rather than wait for them to attack the bomber force.
The 554th Fighter Group and its new Mustangs had changed the nature of the air war, and in doing so had rescued the 8th Air Force faltering strategic bombing campaign. Now it became absolutely essential to get as many P-51s to England as possible. Only then could the Luftwaffe be driven from Europe's skies. In December of 1943, Colonel Don Blakesey paid a visit to the 354th Fighter Group and spent several days teaching the new outfit some of the finer points of air combat tactics used against the Luftwaffe.
He led our mission 3 times, and he obviously liked what he found with the P-51, because he went back and pulled strings until the 4th group got him. So he liked it, no question.
Blakesley, after flying with the 354th, fell in love with the Mustang. So he went to the CO of the 8th Fighter Command, General Ike Kepner, and begged Kepner for Mustangs for the 4th Fighter Group. Kepner agreed to let his group convert, provided that they get in the air and fly combat as quickly as possible. And so Blakesley agreed, and he went back to the group. He trained the guys very quickly on the P-51, and within just a few days of converting, they were in the skies over Germany. And with their new Mustangs, the 4th Fighter Group went on to become one of the highest scoring outfits of the war. They finished combat in Europe and didn't fly in the Pacific. So just in Europe, they scored over 1,000 air and ground victories.
As more P-51Bs arrived in England, the 8th Air Force began to convert its P-47 groups. In January, only about 50 P-51s were combat-ready to escort the bombers over Germany. By April, however, almost 400 were available, and some of the hottest squadrons in England were now equipped with the revolutionary fighter. As the number of Mustangs in Europe increased, the Luftwaffe's losses skyrocketed. Through the spring of 1944, the German Air Force lost between 10 and 30% of its fighter pilots each month. While the Luftwaffe always had planes on hand, by the summer of 1944 it faced a pilot shortage so acute that it proved impossible to solve. Though the Mustang was winning the war in the air, the P-51B model did have a number of bugs that took time to be ironed out. Some of these defects could be disastrous in combat.
We had initially a problem with gun feed. You're in a high-speed turn and pull up to so many Gs and it would stop your guns from firing.
And the wing was so narrow that you couldn't stand the machine guns upright in the wing. They had to be over at about a 45-degree angle. And consequently, the belt, when it came over with the shells, every once in a while, as it came over that hump, they'd jam. And so it wasn't at all unusual to fire off a few bursts and have all your guns jam.
In fact, a couple of mechanics in our group devised the system which would keep it feeding no matter how many Gs you put on.
In the early summer of 1944, most of the issues with the P-51B had been solved. The B would remain in service at least until the end of 1944, but long before that, a new version of the Mustang had entered service. Dubbed the P-51D, it would soon earn a reputation as the ultimate Mustang variant.
A lot of the 51s had 1,500, 14 and 1,500 horsepower. The Ds, the ones they used the most, had 1650 in those Packard Merlin engines. The visibility is the main thing, because the Bs and Cs had the windshield and all the glass fared right into the back of the aircraft. The D had a big bubble canopy on it, and you had unlimited visibility in that. And that was the biggest advantage, plus the fact that they had more horsepower a little bit. And they had 6 50 caliber machine guns on board, 3 in each plane. And they had different drop bomb shackles and stuff on them. I shot the 6 several times just to make sure that we knew what was going to happen, because they'd slow you down, 50 miles an hour the minute you start firing. The recoil would slow the airplane right down. And when you had all 6 of them going, it really looks like that.
At this time of the war, a lot of our duty was strafing and dive bombing. And with our new Ds, we went out on a dive bombing mission, and we had, in the 3 missions we flew that day, I think we had 8 planes that peeled the wings off on the dive. And the extra gun in each wing had weakened the wings so that right in the middle of your dive, a wing would peel back. Not a terrible place to be. You got a bomb you're riding down, and even if you jump, you're going to be in the middle of the explosion. And we got back, they grounded the P-51. And we didn't fly for a couple of days, and then they had modified the wing. we got it back and used it the rest of the war.
With the success of the Mustangs in England, fighter units in Italy began converting to the P-51. One of the first outfits to do so was the 332nd Fighter Group, which initially received P-51Bs and Cs but finished in the war with the D model. Dubbed the Red Tails, the 332nd was one of the most unique organizations in Army Air Force history.
The 332nd was the only all-black fighter group in the United States Air Force. Because of the racial situation in America at that time, they were subject to a great deal of abuse and racial prejudice, even while they were fighting this war. But despite those problems that they had with their fellow servicemen, they rose above those issues, and they performed admirably, especially in the role of escorts for the heavy bombers in the Italian theater.
Commanded by Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., seen here briefing his men, the Red Tails took their new job very seriously. Meticulously prepared and dedicated, the 332nd proved to be the most outstanding escort group of the war.
They had an excellent reputation, and we were always very happy to see them. They were readily identified with that red tail. And yes, I can, now that I think about it, I can recall at least once when there were fighters approaching us and they took off after them, and we went on to the target without a single fighter getting into us. But I'm sure that happened more often than we knew about, too.
The 332nd Fighter Group claims one of the most unique distinctions of World War II. Despite all the missions they flew and despite all the opposition they encountered over Germany, especially towards the end of the war, they never lost a bomber that they escorted in any of the groups that they flew with. No other fighter group in World War II can claim that kind of an honor or distinction.
While other units scored more of aerial victories, the Red Tails earned the respect and admiration of the 15th Air Force's bomber crews. Where once the Tuskegee Airmen had been spurned and derided, by the end of the war, the bomber groups were requesting them as their escort.
We had a good escort. The black guys, they would fly the 51s, and they'd come up and as we was coming back off our mission, and see one group would take us into the target, and then the other group would escort us home. And so as we was being escorted home, the black guys would get out there, and there was one in particular, he was a card. He'd get out there and do all kinds of tricks with that plane, it amused us,
The Red Tails had become the ultimate little friends, and through their efforts had forged a bond in the air that transcended race and color.
Meanwhile, as the groups such as the Pioneer Mustangs and the Red Tails battled the Luftwaffe, the P-51 was poised to bring the war home to another enemy, the Japanese. Soon, the Mustangs would control the skies over Tokyo itself, ensuring Japan's total and irreversible defeat. Early Mustang variants, such as the P-51A and the A-36, had seen action against the Japanese as early as 1943 in the China-Burma-India theater. Those early days of the Mustang operations were unspectacular, but the plane did prove to be faster than anything the Japanese could pit against it. Most frequently, however, the early Mustangs were called upon to deliver ground strikes, strafing targets in Burma and China. Mustang pilots would also go after shipping along the Burma coast, hoping to choke off the supplies to the Imperial Army fighting in the jungle. It was not until the capture of Iwo Jima that the Mustang truly came into its own in the Pacific.
We had a whole bunch of Army P-51 Mustangs. That's the reason we took down, spent all that blood, was to provide a staging base for the P-51s to escort the B-29s on their raids against Japan. The 29s were all out of Saipan and Tinian, where we had just come from, 700 miles south, and the 51s would pick them up or meet them as they come over Saipan or over Iwo on the way to Tokyo, and escort them to Tokyo and back, which was 1,500 miles up and back to Iwo.
These fighter escort missions, taking the B-29s to Japan from Iwo Jima, took anywhere from 7 to 8 hours to complete. And even though the P-51 was an excellent airplane to fly, the strain on the legs and lower backs of these pilots for flying for that length of time caused many of them to be cramped up when they returned from these missions, to the point where they had to be assisted out of their airplanes by the ground crews. And so to do this day after day, over and over again, took a great deal of courage and stamina on the parts of these pilots.
First missions we flew were bomber escort, and once we got there and flying up and down the bomber line, we could pick out targets on the ground. We'd go down and nothing definite at first, and later on we had definite targets, like at Sugi Air Base was one of our first targets, and the B-29s would take us up there specifically to make this run on this air base. They'd wait for us offshore. We'd go in, hit the aircraft and installations on these air bases in Japan. B-29s on this type of mission were just escorting us. There are navigational planes, and they'd stay about 20,000 feet offshore, and we always gave them a high cover. At least 4 P-51s stay above them, protecting them, waiting for us to get off the target and come back. On one occasion, after we'd finished working over this target, we homed in on the B-29, was sending us the signal, the locator where we could find him. As we approached it, we could see the Japanese starting to make passes on our B-29, which gave us a little bit of worry, because he was our ticket back home. And fortunately, the high cover prevented this, and they shot down the attacking Japanese before we got there.
By the spring of 1945, Mustangs roamed the length and breadth of the Japanese home islands, protecting the heavy bomber streams while searching for targets of opportunity. Japan's interceptor force was soon driven from the skies.
So happened on this mission over Japan, we were flying in high cover for the B-29s. We were up around 25,000 feet, and suddenly I lost power, and the manifold pressure dropped way back, and I thought I had serious engine problems. I sweated out for a little while, and I called my wingman, so I'm going to have to go down. And I was just looking for a spot to bail out, because this is the day they firebombed Tokyo and Yokohama pretty badly, and the fireballs were coming up 5,000 feet high. And so I thought I'd get out offshore as far as I could if I had to jump out. As I was descending, trying to get my engine running again, we noticed several Tojos below us and climbing towards the B-29s. And I was directly behind one Tojo, so I just closed in as fast as I could and opened fire. And the debris started flying off, and my wingman shot one on the left side there. So I still was concerned about my engine, but I forgot it during the combat. And I didn't realize till I got well off the target, the engine was running pretty well again.
With little fuel available and even fewer experienced pilots, Japan's air defenses collapsed.
Yeah, there was quite a difference in the Japanese pilots near the end of the war. In fact, I think the group we ran into, the Tojos, I think it was just a big training group, because they were just flying. There was no evasive attempt or anything on their part. And we just closed in on them and just like shooting ducks. If I had had a better engine, I probably would have stayed longer in that group. But there's several of them were shot down by the other P-51 pilots.
By the summer of 1945, the Iwo-based Mustangs had gained total control of the skies over Japan. Without fear of interception, the P-51s went down the deck and searched for targets of opportunity. Nothing was safe from their murderous 50 cals. When Japan finally surrendered in August of 1945, there were hundreds of P-51s based on Iwo Jima ready to support the planned invasion of Kyushu. Fortunately, the surrender made that operation unnecessary. In the final months of the war in Europe, almost 2,000 Mustangs protected the American heavy bombers. Such protective shield proved almost impossible for the Luftwaffe to penetrate. Bomber losses plummeted and Germany's cities and industries were systematically devastated by the American strategic bombing campaign. With the fighters knocking down every German plane they saw in the sky and the bombers pulverizing Germany's war industry on the ground, the Allied forces were virtually unopposed in the air. Flak and small arms fire, however, still posed a great threat, especially to the liquid-cooled engine of the Mustang.
We were out on a search and destroy mission. I found 6 German trucks on the road, went in strafing and set 4 of them on fire on the first pass and pulled up. I had not seen any return fire, so I went back to get the other 2. And when I went back the second time, I find myself going across a open field with 100 German soldiers on their knees with rifles firing at us. And probably they came from the trucks we'd burned. And a P-51 will not take a lot of punishment. If you lose your coolant, you're done. And I lost my coolant. I got up to 8,000 feet, and the coolant temperature hit the red peg, and there was no way. I began to lose power. Started calling for Mayday for a fix. Said I'd pulled the red handle, and the canopy flew off just like they told me it would. I started to jump, and I had my shoulder straps laying on my shoulder. Pulled me back. I picked up the microphone, said goodbye, undid the shoulder strap, made another jump. I hit the end of the radio cord, couldn't get back, drop back in. As long as I was back, I said goodbye, unplugged the radio, made a third attempt, and got my head out. I'm going 100 miles an hour, 105 maybe, and the wind caught my goggles and pulled them out about a foot from my head. I pulled my head back, and they snapped back, and I dropped back down in the seat. So I plugged the radio in and said goodbye, took the helmet off, and 4th try I got out. Found myself hanging very quietly over a tank battle down below me. Quiet up in the air, no sound in the air, but a lot of sound, gunfire, both heavy and light gunfire down below. I was east of Metz, and the Germans still held Metz. I get on the ground, I hid under a bush. A German half-track pulled into the field, and 2 soldiers with rifles were looking for me. I thought, well, they know I'm here, so I stood up and put my hand up. Got halfway there, and I noticed that over the German Iron Cross was a crudely painted white star, and there were a captured vehicle, and they were part of Patton's 3rd Army, and they were 40 miles ahead of where people thought they were, and so I got a ride with them. And the next day they flew me back by a Cub observation plane, my base.
Even though the liquid-cooled engine was a drawback when the 51s were used to hit ground targets, the Mustang was still considered to be the best mass-produced fighter of the war, and some would argue of all time. Near the end of World War II, the Mustang's apex of success had been reached. But even at this pinnacle, the shadow of its own downfall could be seen on the horizon.
With the advent of the Messerschmitt 262, the first operational jet fighter, the Germans had really dealt the death blow to the piston engine fighter design. And while the Messerschmitt 262 really represented the future, the pilots flying the older designs, the Mustangs, really figured out in the final days of the war how best to fight their aircraft against this new technological marvel. And so on many occasions, the Mustang pilots actually came out on top, despite the Messerschmitt 262's amazing speed.
On this particular day, in April 45, I was on a search and destroy mission. I was at 12,000 feet with 4 planes. I spotted movement down below me, and I recognized the silhouette of a Messerschmitt 262 jet, and I had 10,000 feet altitude. He was at 2. So I rolled over. I was determined he wasn't going to get away from me, so I beat Chuck Yeager through the sound barrier. I thought the airplane was coming apart. I went into what's called compressibility, lost complete control of the aircraft. It felt like the control stick had become unhooked. It was all over the cockpit and nothing happened. And, as I'm going down to lower altitude, the thicker the air got, the more I began to feel something on the stick. I prayed for it to be there, and I began to ease out, and I came out, and would you believe the 262 was right square in front of me. I don't think I moved 2 degrees before I started shooting. And I shot a piece of one wing off and shot the left jet set the left jet on fire. And I was overrunning him, so I pulled off and was going to come back, but by the time I pulled off, he was going straight up. P-51s won't go straight up very long. I tried to go after him, but he was going straight up, and I thought I'd lost him. One jet was burning, and all of a sudden he stopped and started sliding back down, tail first, and he ejected and hung in his parachute. And I felt like the champion of the world. I was ecstatic. In 1996, I think it was, I went to the German fighter pilots meeting and met the pilot I shot down. He and his wife both gave me a big hug. He says, "You saved my life." He said, "I had 25 pilots in my unit when you shot me down." And he said he had a bullet wound in his left side, so he never had to fly again. And because of that, he said 3 weeks later, there were only 4 of my unit alive. And he said, "So you saved my life." I said, "No problem, buddy, anytime."
When the war ended, the new jet fighters like the P-80 and F-86 soon eclipsed the Mustang as America's premier air superiority fighter. But for a fleeting moment, the P-51 had become a king of the skies. But all too soon, the march of technology had bumped it from its throne. Within just a few years of the war's end, the Mustang had been relegated to second-line steps. Altogether, about 15,000 P-51s had been built, but thousands were scrapped wholesale in the months following the end of the war. Others, a precious few, were sold off to racing pilots and enthusiasts. During the first year of the Korean War, the Mustang reclaimed a bit of its lost glory as it was pressed back into service as a ground attack aircraft. but with its vulnerable liquid-cooled engine, the P-51 was replaced as quickly as possible with a more modern jet aircraft. Today, the once mighty horde of the Mustang that conquered the skies of Europe has been reduced to less than 100 flying examples. Every year at air shows throughout the United States, these precious relics take to the air before crowds of thousands, reminding Americans of our proud aviation heritage and those grueling days when the Mustangs filled the skies in a desperate fight for freedom.
Never had anybody say they didn't want to fly. In fact, it was just the other way around. People hanging on my back saying, "Come on, he flew yesterday. I want to put me on today." Does that mean it was fun? No, it's dead serious. We did every job we were given the entire war and did them well. It cost us a lot of people. It was another way you proved that what Sherman said was right, that war is hell, and it is.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.